this because there are some people that don't have access to knowledge and other people. So there's limited access. Okay. All right. So part of why I wanted to pose this question for us today is because it kind of as a good springboard. Why does poverty exist? Well, it's a good springboard into our conversation about industrialization today. A lot of in the dominant narrative, the belief has always been historically that America was known to the world as the land of opportunity, the land of opportunity. Right? How many of you heard of that before? Right? And that at least the way it's typically been talked about in books about American history and even in popular culture like movies, or it's like America is this wonderful, glorious place where people came from all over the world, and there was just this land of opportunities for everyone. But yet, we also know that doesn't poverty also exist over here? Right? So how can you have both opportunity and poverty at the same time? Right? And did everyone, so it raises the question, did everyone have access to opportunity? And historically, was America the land of opportunity for everybody? And to what extent did all groups of people have the same kind of access to opportunity? And so today, as we look at this question of opportunities and industrialization, certainly industrialization impacted people's access to opportunity. I'm not getting there we go. All right. And so the central question for us to think about today is, to what extent was America the land of opportunity for people of Mexican descent specifically, right? In the 1880s to the 1920s. Okay. And I put this image here of the Statue of Liberty, right? Because historically, that statue has often been kind of like the symbol when it was first put there in New York, right? It was kind of like the beacon to the rest of the world. And as a matter of fact, there is a little poem written there on the pedestal of this statue that says something like, "Send us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free," right? And basically what that poem was meaning was that the statue and the poem was intended to send a message to the world, right? That America was a place of opportunity, right? And America was basically telling the world, like, send us your poor people, we'll take them, right? Now, are there stories of poor people coming to America and finding opportunity?
Yes.
Absolutely. Those stories exist. And we'll talk about a couple of them today even. There are stories of, the rags to riches story, right? And certainly many groups of people, particularly those that came from Europe, found opportunity here. Okay. But as we start looking at other groups that came to America, particularly over here to the west, right? For the Mexicano population, or for the Chinese population, and other groups that made their way around this time period, were they afforded the same access to opportunity in America as Europeans? And so that's kind of what we're going to look at today. So this time period of industrialization was unfolding rapidly, and I'm just kind of curious, when you hear the word industrialization, like, what do you think of? What do you picture? Michael?
Factories making a lot of the same thing.
Okay, factories making things. Vanessa?
Corporation, like a big corporation.
Okay, so big corporations, big businesses. Okay. Luis?
Underage workers.
Oh, underage workers. Okay. All right. What else do you visualize or think of? All those things are pretty right on. Manny?
Certain places, poor conditions.
Okay.
Hazardous work sites.
All right. Poor conditions, hazardous workplace. All right. So by and large, when you think of industrialization, do you think of something generally that was positive that took place in our history, or something negative?
Positive.
Who says positive? All right. Who says negative? Who says both? Okay. Who doesn't know? Who doesn't care? No, I'm just kidding. All right. The safe answer is both, obviously, right? But here's by and large, in the dominant narrative, typically what we've gotten is that industrialization was this awesome thing that took place in our history, right? And there might have been one or two bad things that took place, but overall, it was all for the better, right? And I want to disrupt that narrative a little bit. I want us to challenge that accepted way of thinking about that time frame. I want us to challenge and question, was it really the land of opportunity? Is it okay to question that? Is it okay to raise the question, did industrialization really bring us more good than harm, or did it bring us more harm than good? Okay, let's dig a little deeper and find out, what this time frame was about, right? The truth of the matter is, not only we want to understand industrialization, but did it affect Mexican people? Were Mexican people around back then? Oh yeah, we talked about this with the first lecture on people being displaced of their lands. Right? What did that mean? What did that mean? What impact might it have had where we just came out of a time period where Mexican people fought a war to defend their lands, and now they lose their lands? What is that? How is that going to play into industrialization, do you think? Right? Mexican people, were they a part of industrialization? Like owning the factories and running them? Not quite, right? But they did participate. They were affected by industrialization. Industrialization brought a lot of change. One of my favorite pictures is two Mexican women here who worked on the railroad. And this is a picture you probably will not see in a traditional American history textbook, right? What you would probably see is a picture of a guy by the name of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a big businessman who owned up the railroad companies. He kind of monopolized the rail industry in America. And that kind of goes to what Howard Zinn criticizes, right? Typically what we've got in American history is top-down history, right? History from the point of view of the wealthy and the powerful. Okay. And what we want to try to do, at least with Howard Zinn's book, is give us some bottom-up history, right? Right? From those that were actually the working poor, right? And what would it have been like to be from their point of view? Was industrialization such a great thing? Okay. And in order to understand that, we need to think about the impact of industrialization and what it means. What does industrialization refer to generally? Okay, so maybe it'll help us to kind of just have kind of a generic definition so that we know what we're talking about when we say industrialization. Okay, industrialization basically refers to a time period. Okay, a time period where there was tremendous technological change in society, a lot of change, accompanied by new inventions in industry. Sometimes industrialization is referred to as the Industrial Revolution. Right? How many of you have heard of it that way? Okay. Yeah, the Industrial Revolution not because revolution because there was a war being fought, but revolution because it radically revolutionized how people lived. Okay. The new inventions and new changes and so forth brought change to how we lived and worked. And so the changes and the technological inventions and all that stuff influence how people lived and worked, both positively and negatively. You all, for comparison's sake, you all have lived through what we could call a technological revolution, right? You've all seen technology has really revolutionized how we live and how we work, how we communicate, yeah? Well, here we go, how we teach, right, with technology. Okay, the technological revolution that you all have lived through, good thing or bad thing? Yeah, yeah. We tend to think of all the good here, right? Oh man, I got a Facebook, I got my little iPhone, right? All those kinds of things. But what would be kind of to keep us in check here? What would be kind of a negative of our technological revolution?
Cell phones,
How is that a negative?
media, always be on your phone, constantly watching it every second.
Okay, but what's wrong with that? What's wrong with looking at our phones all the time?
You probably get the wrong information.
Okay, there's too much information. Maybe the wrong information. What else? What's that? Oh, okay. So there's more pollution and toxins in what we breathe and what we take in. Absolutely. What's that? We can become dependent on technology. So then we don't have it. Everybody freaking out. Is that happening? Okay. Go ahead, Tracy.
I think we lose our social skills. We don't interact.
Yeah.
Phone and it's like text me. It's like really.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think we're losing that.
Yeah, we're all into Facebook, but we don't want to do like the real face, right? Face to face, right here, right? I went into a restaurant once and I see these couples having dinner. And they're sitting right in front of each other, and both of them are like this, scrolling through their phones and their phone in their face. I'm like, what's going on here, right? You got somebody sitting right in front of you, and yeah. So and some studies have suggested that the technological revolution we lived through has had a detrimental, negative effect on our social skills, and that we're becoming more isolated from each other, and all these kinds of. So there's a danger of that too, right? So. And then not to mention the fact that I think, Debbie, you were kind of alluding to this idea that in the construction, the making, I don't even know how many of you may be aware of, what does it take to make one of these darn things? And who's making them? And how much are they getting paid? Right? And how much of the earth are we destroying to make these things? Are you guys even aware of this stuff? No, it's kind of outside of our field of vision, right? And sometimes when major changes happen that have negative effects, sometimes we don't want to pay attention to the negative effects, right? So could there have been some negative things about industrialization, right? Now we're knowing, right? There's one picture here on your left, pollution. Now we're finding out 100 plus years later, right? That industrialization, brought about some negative things, okay? Maybe in order to think about whether industrialization was a good or bad thing, it might help us to think about what life was like before industrialization, right? Just for a minute, the pre-industrial world. Before industrialization, we were more of an agriculturally based society, right? Things were a lot slower. Okay. Let's take Ricardo, for example. Okay, let's say, Ricardo, you were, before industrialization, Ricardo was, let's say you were a shoemaker. And everybody in the community knew you wanted the best shoes. Go see Ricardo the shoemaker. And you can imagine he had a workshop with a nice big workbench and tools hanging and pieces of leather and other materials in his work area and he had this long 20-plus year career of being a shoemaker. Okay. Now, along comes industrialization. How would that affect Ricardo the shoemaker? He might go out of business, you think, Michael?
Yeah, put him out of business.
Okay, how's that? Why would he have to go out of business, Vanessa?
Because if he's making a shoe one by one and making it his own, a factory can make like 20 shoes.
Oh, yeah, now...
Different menus of work.
Yeah, now he's got to deal with the big shoe factory down the way.
The mass supply.
Yeah, and over here at the shoe factory, they're cranking out shoes like nobody's business, right? And poor old Ricardo, maybe on a good day, is able to make 2-3 pairs of shoes. You think maybe something like that? And down at the shoe factory, they're dealing in volume, right? Mass producing shoes. They got assembly lines of workers cranking out shoes, right? And so ultimately, it becomes kind of an economics lesson here, right? That at the shoe factory they deal in volume, so they can charge less for their shoes, right? They make more profit because they're selling lots of them, whereas Ricardo's making fewer of them, so he has to charge more for them to make his profit, right? And so now his shoes cost more than the shoes at the shoe factory. It's going to be hard for him to compete there, isn't it? And let's say I own the shoe factory and I see Ricardo as my competition, right? Ricardo's got a lot of loyal customers, right? I want those customers, right? I might want to do what? Buy him out, yeah. Ricardo, hey, come work for me. Now, Ricardo might hold out and say, no, I've been doing my own shoes. I'm going to keep going. Oh, okay, you want to play hardball, eh? So maybe I drop my shoe prices lower and lower, and all of his customers start coming over to me. Long story short, eventually, he's going to go out of business, right? So industrialization, in this case, good thing or bad thing for Ricardo the shoemaker? Bad thing, yeah. Those are some things, some realities that certainly played out. I mean, this was a hypothetical, but absolutely there were examples of this playing out. And so industrialization brought certain characteristics to it. Okay, and I want to kind of go over some of the basic characteristics of industrialization. Okay, we need to understand this big thing that was happening called industrialization, and then we'll talk about how it affected Mexicanos here in the Southwest, how Mexican people might have been affected. Okay, so some basic characteristics of industrialization we've kind of already mentioned here. Assembly lines, mass production. Okay. Now, assembly lines, a good thing or a bad thing? Okay, let's start with good. What's good about assembly lines? Faster, okay, Mike? Jobs for people? Okay. Cheaper products being made? Things available for people? Any downsides to assembly lines? Yeah. Ricardo's shoes, you think were better or worse than those shoes at the shoe factory? Yeah, quality, craftsmanship. Okay, we'll come back to that point in a minute. All right. Another characteristic during this time period was something called urbanization, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on. But it's basically a fancy way to describe the trend of movement to cities. That people began to migrate towards the big cities, mainly because that's where factories were setting up shop. And as people in the rural areas began to feel the pressures of not having the means of survival and so forth, people gravitated to the cities to find work. New factories went to the cities because that's where the people were, and so on and so forth. So the growth of major cities like we know them today began to unfold. Okay, and so big cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, over here to the west, San Francisco, and so forth. The growth of cities as we know them today, good thing or bad thing? Yeah, some good and bad, right? With big cities come big city problems, right? Dense housing and such, and crime and so forth. All right. Thirdly, monopolies. Monopolization was one of the trends and characteristics of industrialization that unfolded, where you had large companies taking control of entire parts of our economy, monopolizing industries and ultimately eliminating competition, such as in our shoe factory example, right? You might think of as an example here the game Monopoly. Right? How many of you ever played Monopoly before? Okay. Do people even play board games these days? Okay. Monopoly. I remember we used to play that as kids. Besides that, it took a long time to play the game. When you play the game Monopoly, how do you win? What do you have to do to win? You have to own up everything on the board, right? You want to buy up Boardwalk and Park Place and all the big properties. And in order for you to ultimately win, what has to happen to the people you're playing against? They have to go bankrupt, right? They lose everything, and you take over all the wealth. What a very American game, huh? One person ends up with everything, and everybody else ends up broke, okay? And that's why it's called monopolization, right? From the root word mono, which means one. Okay. Now, during industrialization, were there some of these monopolists in real life, some of these industrialists? Who were some of these guys?
GM.
Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller. Right? You can read about him in Zen. He monopolized the oil industry with his Standard Oil Company. Right? One big oil company. That was it. Okay. Who else? Yeah. Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie. Right? Who monopolized the steel industry. Okay. Those are the big ones, right? Vanderbilt in the railroad industry, J.P. Morgan, all these, and these were people that were able to, take control of entire industries, right? And of course, these names that I just mentioned to you are still around today, right? Rockefeller, Carnegie, Carnegie Foundation. Right? So these names today are still associated with wealth, right? That's what we call today old money. Because it was money that was established back during that time. Those people that Howard Zinn calls the robber barons, right? That developed amassed these huge fortunes. Okay. All right. So monopolization, a good thing or a bad thing? Well, good for the monopolists, bad for everybody else. Yeah. Yeah, and so monopolization is definitely, a reality of what happened with industrialization. Okay, and we'll talk more about that going forward. All right, and another characteristic of industrialization: exploitation of workers. Okay, and this goes back to the assembly lines and the factories. And what was it like if you were a factory worker? Yeah, long hours, low wages. Back then, of course, it was you didn't have very many labor laws, so you even had child labor, and you had people working, 12-hour shifts even, for very low wages on the assembly lines. People living hand to mouth, and this was an outgrowth of this industrial era, right? And in many ways, one of the critiques of industrialization is that these monopolists managed to accumulate large sums of wealth, often as a result of exploiting workers, taking advantage, abusing workers. Okay. And of course, it's this area here, this category, that we want to spend some time talking about here. Right, because typically this is something that is overlooked in the dominant narrative. You might talk about it a little bit, but this is what affected the majority of the population. Were there a lot of people that were monopolists, or very few? Very few. Were there a lot of people that were workers, or very few? A lot. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind. Okay. Now, in order to understand and talk a little bit about exploitation of workers, it's important to talk about this guy right here. Okay. Now, how many of you have heard of Karl Marx before? Okay. Often in the dominant narrative, Karl Marx is demonized. Oh, the boogeyman, right? But it's unfortunate because most people who kind of demonize Karl Marx probably have not read very much of Karl Marx's work. But if you study, for example, sociology, you'll probably read Karl Marx. Okay, he's one of the pillars of sociological theory and thought. But he was not the devil. Karl Marx was a journalist, a philosopher. Okay, he actually spent most of his life writing. Okay, and having done some graduate studies in sociology, I could tell you Karl Marx's writings are pretty dense, and some of his books are about that thick, okay? But I'm going to give you just a taste because I think it's important to understand what he was saying so that you can understand industrialization, okay? Because let's look at the time period that he lived, right? He basically saw this change happen, right? He was alive in the pre-industrial period. And he saw this change unfold, not just in the United States, but he saw it in Europe. Okay, and Karl Marx was troubled by what he saw. happening. He didn't see industrialization as this necessarily wonderful thing. Okay. He wrote about a lot of topics, but one of the topics he also wrote about was this process and this change that was happening. In order to understand what he was saying, let's go back to Ricardo the shoemaker for a minute. Okay. For Ricardo the shoemaker, was it just about making shoes for him? Was it just a job?
No.
What was it for him? It was his life. Right? I mean, where do you think he might have even learned how to make shoes? Probably his dad, and his dad from his dad, and so forth, right? And that's how people learned these crafts back then, right? It was skills that were handed down, you know. And so, you know, for Ricardo the shoemaker, it was his life, you know. Do you think he knew the people that bought his shoes? Yeah, probably. And it's probably fair to say that he had probably loyal customers, people that came to him on a regular, right? Ricardo used to make my shoes, you know. Now here's my boy. I want you to make his shoes too, right?
Keep it coming.
Yeah, and you know, and you can imagine the pride that Ricardo felt going into town and seeing people walking around wearing the shoes that he made, right? How did that make him feel, do you think? Happy? Good? Proud? Yeah? Like he was contributing something to society, right? Validating his existence, right? As a human being. Okay? Now, let's compare that sense of fulfillment to the assembly line workers at the shoe factory. Let's say you guys right here, starting with Tracy, down to Vanessa and Alejandro, all the way back on down. Same kind of experience? No. No, because you got Tracy over here, you know, she's cutting up pieces of leather all day, right? And then she's passing that down to Vanessa. And Vanessa, maybe she's like, I don't know, poking holes in leather all day long. Passes it down to Alejandro, and he's stitching or gluing soles or whatever, right? And all the way on down until the end, you get a completed pair of shoes, right? Do each of them know independently how to make a complete pair of shoes? Mm-mm. Do any of them even know personally the people who are buying the shoes? Are they feeling the same satisfaction as Ricardo the shoemaker? Mm-mm. Do they feel a sense of fulfillment? That their existence is being validated? No. How are they feeling, do you think? 12 hours of poking holes and cutting leather and all that.
Ready to go home.
Exhausted, right? You know, as human beings, we're not robots, right? But when you're being made to do the exact same thing over and over and over again for hours on end, you know, probably doesn't make you feel very human, right? As a matter of fact, Karl Marx, this is what he was troubled about. And he saw what was happening. And he spent a lot of his time writing about this idea here. He spent a lot of time writing about dehumanization. Dehumanization. And basically what Marx spent some time writing about was this idea that he saw that industrialization was having a dehumanizing effect on people. And he was wondering why this is happening. He saw people like Vanessa, the assembly line worker, and said, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this to yourself? Why are you letting yourself be exploited this way? Why would these people at the factory be enduring this?" What do you think?
Poverty.
They need the money. What's that? Survival. They need to survive. Do they have any other choices? No. See, Marx wanted to understand what conditions would make it so that exploitation is happening. What are the conditions that make this possible? And so he wrote about exploitation. He tried to understand it. Okay, I'm going to give you one good slide here of Marx, okay, and then we'll kind of move on here for a little bit, okay. And he theorized, okay. He wrote about a lot of complex things. So I'm going to try to unpack some of it for you. He wrote about class conflict, and he said, look, our society is not just this really cool organized system. Our society is a system in conflict with itself. Groups of people divided into classes. And we have Marx to thank for providing a class analysis of the emerging capitalistic economy. Okay? And Marx basically said what many of you were saying when I asked, why does poverty exist? Okay, many of you talked about the wealthy. Wealthy people have some kind of agenda, and poor people. Okay, that's kind of towards what Marx was writing about. Okay, society was divided up into classes, and we'll come back to that point in a minute. But he also wrote about exploitation, and he basically said that the conditions have to be in place for exploitation to happen. And in order for exploitation to happen, you need three things, three characteristics in any capitalist system for exploitation to happen. Okay, for people like these assembly line workers to end up in where they're at, three conditions have to exist. Number one, and I would encourage you to write in your own words, okay? The first ingredient for exploitation to happen is you have to have private ownership. And that was one of the things emerging in industrialization, right? Was the idea of private ownership, where you have the means of production, and this is Marx's words now. Means of production basically, the way things are made, is by private ownership. You have a small group of people in society that he referred to as the capitalists. Okay, these would be like your Rockefellers and your Carnegies, etc. Okay, that own the means of production. Okay, so that's one ingredient. Did we have that ingredient? Absolutely. Okay. We cool with that so far? Okay, the second ingredient. And this is why I encourage you to write in your own words, okay? The inability of the workers, or what Marx called the proletarians, to survive without selling their labor power to the capitalists. In other words, no choice but to be a worker. Okay. And that goes back to the assembly line workers here, right? Tracy, Vanessa, and Alejandro. Did they have a choice? No. Was Ricardo going to have a choice? No, his shoemaking business is going to cave in, and he's going to end up with no choice. Okay, so you create conditions where people have no choice but to become workers for someone else. That's what this one is saying. Okay, is that cool? All right. Private ownership and people with no choice, and then lastly, the third one has to deal with the role of the government. Hey, what is the role of the government anyway? Well, I was always told the government's there to be, of the people, by the people, and for the people, right? That's what Marx saw? What did he see? Who's the government for? The wealthy, okay. The government, or what Marx referred to as the state, okay, the ruling power. The state which uses its strength to protect, not the people, but to protect the unequal distribution of power and property in society. Okay, and as you read Howard Zinn, for example, with the robber barons and his other chapters, you will learn that did people like the Rockefellers and Carnegies have influence in government and the decisions and the laws that got passed? Yeah. But we all have the power to influence government, don't we? We all get to vote. Just saying, why are you laughing at me? We don't? We don't all have equal influence on government? People with wealthy people have more influence than us? They can. I know. Right. I know. I hate to burst our bubbles, but that's the truth in America, right? Increasingly so, even to this day. So that Marx said, okay, once you have these three ingredients in place, guess what you're going to have? You're going to have exploitation. Okay. And so he tried to understand the processes, the conditions, what was unfolding that was creating the situation of exploitation. Okay. Pretty straightforward stuff. Okay, questions? Okay, can I go to the next slide? Okay. Like I said, in your own words is best. That way you looking at it later on can understand it. Okay. All right. The next slide I'm going to show you is just a picture, a visual to help us think about what we saw happening in America, and the growth of our capitalistic economy. Okay. And I'm trying to simplify Marx, okay, because we don't have all day. Okay. But we could probably make this graphic a lot more complicated, okay, but I'm going to simplify it. So first of all, Marx did believe that we had a society divided up into classes, that we have what he called the capitalists or the upper class, right? And who were those people? Well, they were the elites that own the means of production, right? And when Marx explained the growth of capitalism, he actually used a factory as a model to explain capitalism in society. So if you think about a factory, who do you have at the very top? The factory owner, right? And so these would be the owners, okay? And so if you look at in our capitalistic economy, those are the people that own the monopolize the industries, okay? Then you had what Marx referred to as the petty bourgeoisie, okay? Just a fancy way to say the professional managerial class, or sometimes we call the middle class, right? The professional managerial class. Now, do they own the factories? No. Who are they? Managers. They oversee production, right? So you have the factory owner. Does the owner go in there and get his hands dirty? No. Sends this group, and these are the managers that oversee production. And so that would be like in the factory. This would be like the foreman, right? The supervisors that come in and, all right, all you assembly line workers, come on, let's keep going, right? They help to maximize profits by making sure that production is unfolding, right? That's their role. So do they profit? No. They help to maximize profits for those guys up there, okay? The professional managerial class or the middle class, okay? Next up you had what Marx referred to as the proletariat class. Sometimes we call them the working class, right? In the case of the factory example, these would be your factory worker, right? Those on the assembly line. Those actually, in whatever industry, those that are getting their fingers dirty and doing the actual grunt work, okay? And this is the group that Marx was most concerned with, the proletariat, the working class, okay? They don't own the means of production. They don't own the factory. They're the ones getting exploited, okay? And basically what Marx said was that not only do we have our society divided up into classes, but that the elite class, they all kind of work together. And what he said was that they have a class consciousness. In other words, they are aware that they are the elites. And that one of the biggest fears that these people had, according to Marx, the biggest fear that they have is that these people would revolt, rebel. Okay. And so that's their biggest fear. And so they spend a lot of their time making sure that doesn't happen. Well, how do they do that? A lot of different ways. Okay. They work on keeping this group divided against itself, or they try to prevent this group from being aware that they're being exploited. Can people be exploited and not know they're being exploited?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Because tied to... Okay, so does this help a little bit? Okay. All right. And again, you have to be aware, and why I used a triangle, because at the very top you have very few people, and over here you had a lot of people. Okay. Just exactly how much of this wealth was being how was this wealth being distributed? Well, let's look at a statistic, okay? And this is, I think Acuna shared this with us, okay? In the early 1900s, wealth was really concentrated at the top, okay? The example that Acuna gives us is that in 1905, 11% of the population owned over 80% of the wealth. Okay? 11% of the population owned 80% of the wealth. Let's think about that statistic for a minute, okay? And this is in the readings from Acuña's book, okay? 11% owning 80%. So that means that the rest of the population, 89% of the population, had to share how much wealth? 20% of the wealth, right? Jeez. Okay, is that an equal or unequal distribution of wealth? Very unequal, right? Very unequal. Okay, 1905. Now here we are, about 100 plus years later, right? Today. Has that unequal distribution of wealth from back then, has it gotten more equal over the 100 years, or has it gotten less equal? Less? Yeah. See, the tendency for us, at least in the dominant narrative, is that America is a story of progress and that we're always getting better. And that, yeah, this might have existed back then, but it's a lot better now. Well, sorry, but you're right, Manny. Okay? This unequal distribution of wealth in 1905 has gotten more unequal. And I think the most recent statistic I remember seeing is that today, something like 3 to 5% of the population owns something like 90 to 95% of the wealth. It's just something crazy like that. Okay? So we have fewer people today with more wealth. And I know it's not the most happiest thing to think of today, but that's just the trend that we've seen over the last 100 years. Huh? And by the way, that middle class group that we're looking at, many economists are saying, what's happening to that middle group? It's shrinking. It's increasingly becoming more difficult to be middle class. Now, economists, one of the indicators they look at to determine whether you are middle class or not is, for example, home ownership. Now, what do we know about home ownership today? Easy or difficult? Difficult, if not impossible. Okay. And it's just a sad reality. Okay. That wasn't always the case in American history. It used to be the case that with each generation, things got easier. Okay. No longer. It was actually probably easier for your parents' generation to buy a home than for your generation. First time in U.S. history that that's the case. Okay. It's the reality of the economic trends that we're seeing. Okay. And that's just, with home ownership. Once upon a time, dad could go to work, mom could stay home with the kids, and you could own a home. You're lying, Corey. Okay. No, it did exist once upon a time, right? Now you could have mom and dad going to work, maybe 2 jobs each, and be lucky if you could buy a home, right? Now you might have to double up a couple of families, right? These are the realities we see today, okay? And it's not like the air we breathe, okay? But here, how do we explain this reality, right? If we go back to this, we were always told that America was the land of opportunity. That you could get here with just a shirt on your back, and you could start here and end up where? Up at the top. That you could start here with poverty and work your way through hard work, right? You can make it if you try, right? That's the American creed, right? Hard work and you'll be rewarded, right? That America was a meritocracy, right? With the root word being merit, right? If you merit something, it basically means you earned it. So if I say we live in a meritocratic society, what am I saying about that society? Yeah, everything you get, you earn, right? You can make it if you try. Just work hard. That's all it takes. How many of you believe, okay, you can make it if you try? Well, but here's the thing. Is it a guarantee? It's not a guarantee, right? And here's a test of this. Okay, let's assume, okay, you can make it if you try. Could everybody make it if everybody tried equally? If we live in a society where the wealth is being distributed unequally, how could you have everybody make it if everybody tried equally? Right? The system is not designed that way, is it? Okay. And so when it comes to this idea of meritocracy, we know that it's largely a myth. Okay? And so this idea that the meritocracy is what we were told America was all about. But yet it is, we know, more of a myth than a reality. Okay. So meritocracy, the notion that upward mobility by individuals in society is based on talent, effort, and ability alone. That all you have to do is just work hard. Okay. And this is what Americans were told about what America is. Okay. And this guy right here, anybody recognize this guy right here? No, it's not Colonel Sanders. This is Andrew Carnegie. And he was actually held up as the poster boy for meritocracy. If you know anything about his story, okay, Andrew Carnegie was an Irish immigrant, came from Ireland, and he got to America like a lot of the Irish. A lot of groups that came, Italians, Irish, right, European groups, they kissed the ground. America, she's a great country, right? And there were many people found their opportunities here, you know. And Andrew Carnegie is the classic rags to riches story because he got here with nothing but the shirt on his back, and he went up that economic ladder, right, from the bottom all the way to the top, and he was held up as the example. You see, huh? Look at him. He did it. See, this is what America's all about. He did it. That means you could do it. And that's that. Hey, look, see, just work hard. Hold on, wait a minute. Now, when it comes to the Irish immigrants that came, was Andrew Carnegie the only one working really hard? Did the other Irish immigrants work hard too, do you think? Huh? So there has to be something else involved here, right? What else do you think was involved in his success? Knowing something. You guys heard this before, right? It's not what you know, but who you know, right? I don't know his story, but the fact that he rose up and all of a sudden, it was like winning the loteria. You don't think some luck was involved here? Yeah, absolutely. That happens all the time. Read the biographies of successful people and find out their stories. A lot of times you'll hear stuff like, I met a guy who knew a guy, right? Or I just happened to be walking into this coffee shop and I met somebody, right? I was working as a waiter and I talked to somebody about what I do, right? Luck, right? Luck plays a lot of it, right? Also, let's be honest. Do you think the fact that he was a man had something to do with it? And that he was white? You don't think that played into it too? If he was a Chinese female, would his story have been different? If he was a Mexicano who had just lost his land, do you think that story played out different? Absolutely, right? So there's all kinds of variables. So this idea of meritocracy, why were people being told then that America is all meritocratic? Yeah. They want you to work hard. So let's think about this hypothetically. Let's suppose, for example, you were all my factory workers, and I was, Covarrubias, the factory owner. Okay, and let's suppose I wanted you to work hard for me, right? Got to find a way to make you work hard. So one day, let's say the whistle blew early. All right, everyone, gather around. We're going to have a company meeting, and I have an important announcement to make to you. John, come on up. John comes over here. I tell everybody, John, he's been coming to work every day and showing his dedication and commitment. He shows up early some days, stays late even. And because of his hard work and effort, he will now be promoted to foreman. And he gets his little merit certificate from the owner, shakes hands, and everybody claps for him. And, well, not everybody, but, you know. And so John is now promoted to supervise you guys now as the foreman. And before the meeting ends, I say, and before you all leave, let me just say this. You too could one day be the foreman, like John, with hard work and dedication. You can happen. Now get back to work. Right? What's the likelihood it's going to be you, Liliana?
Not very likely.
Right? There's only one supervisor, right? Unless you corner John in some dark alley somewhere. It ain't going to happen. Right? But why would I, as a factory owner, want you to believe that you could be the next supervisor? Keep you working hard. Right? Come on. Right? And so you workers go back to work. And Ricardo's like, Híjole, man, I want to be the next foreman, man. And then Tracy's over here, I want to be the next foreman, you know, right? And then maybe the next day, you know, Ricardo comes to work early and sabotages Tracy's workstation, you know. So now so he could be ahead of her. And she sees hey. The next day she sabotages his work. And the two of them are going at it with each other, fighting each other. Meanwhile, who's getting over on both of them? Yeah, factory owner, right? Keeping you workers against each other, keeping you working hard, right? Marx saw this. He saw this in Industrialization, and he referred to this meritocracy idea and you believing in it. He called it false consciousness. False consciousness. And I couldn't resist this picture of Marx throwing us the peace sign. Yeah, he referred to the idea and the belief that people had in meritocracy. He called it false consciousness. The thesis that material and institutional processes in capitalist society are misleading to the proletariat and to other classes. In other words, you're being misled. I think the word you used yesterday, Tracy, bamboozled, hoodwinked, right? You're being duped. You're chasing the carrot, thinking it's going to pay off. Okay, and what Marx really advocated for was that you workers, you need to realize that you're all on the same boat, and instead of working against each other, you need to work together. Instead of having false consciousness, you need to have a working class consciousness. You need to understand that you are part of the same class. Just like the wealthy class, they know that they're all in the same group and they work with each other to maintain their power. You as workers need to develop a critical working class consciousness to help change your reality. Ooh. Well, how do you think the wealthy felt about old Karl Marx and what he was saying? Joaquin, what do you think?
They didn't like what he was saying.
They didn't like what he was saying at all. And this is why Karl Marx has historically been demonized. Because he was about the working class, the proletariat class, and he advocated ultimately for working class revolution. And he advocated for the working people of the world need to unite and break the chains of their oppression. And it's a fascinating story of Karl Marx. You know, that's why he was chased out of several countries, ended up in hiding, in Europe, and spent his last years, in seclusion and hiding, writing. But throughout his life, he actually worked with a lot of trade unions and tried to help to get the workers organized. Okay. Questions at this point? So industrialization brought a lot of conflict, didn't it? Because did Marx have an impact on people? Did workers respond by organizing with each other? Yes, they did. And they organized what we call today unions. Right? And unionization is a part of this history of industrialization. And that's a whole other section we're going to be focusing on going forward. Okay. All right. So can we go on to the next slide? We cool? All right. All right, just for fun, I thought we could, I know, for fun, what? I thought we could look at some quotes from Karl Marx, all right? And what I'd like for you to do in the groups you were with earlier, right, is take each quote at a time and see if you could, I know, because Marx, this is like a type of English that we don't use today, right? So let's see if you could translate these quotes into regular old English, all right? Let's see how good we are at trying to unpack what Marx was saying here. All right? Ready? Get set? Go.